Traditionally, gardeners have seen the battle against weeds as something of a war of extermination without mercy. So the suggestion that they should surrender parts of their garden over to the enemy might have been a bit of a shock. But today I'm joined by RHS gold medal winner Dave Green, and he's here to convince a skeptical public that by balancing native species with more traditional planting, you can achieve something sustainable and beautiful. Dave, we're in this beautiful suburban garden that you designed, and already I've seen a couple of things, ragworts, willow herb, brambles that some gardeners might run a mile from, but you've actually turned them into features. Tell me about that.
Yeah, we're sitting at the back of this large garden, and in this area we've tried to mix together native plants as well as ornamental plants to sort of create a blending of the garden into the sort of natural habitat that's at the back of this area. So we tried to include things like native grass deschampsia, and we've tried to allow things to move in a little bit, like the brambles that you mentioned, and a few willow herbs and some lapsana moving in a little bit. So I think it's really nice to have that mix between the ornamental and the native. And I think it's the diversity of plants that really also bring with it a diversity of wildlife. And so I think that diversity is what we want to encourage in all gardens.
There's a little bit of a debate going on at the moment within gardening. Back at the Chelsea Flower Show, one of the BBC Gardener's World presenters sort of suggested it might be rather passé to weed your garden, but people like Monty Don and Alan Titchmarsh have weighed in this week to advocate for perhaps more traditional gardens. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I think it's nice to have a balance, really, and I think there's a movement now towards letting nature do the work and to try to step back from things a little bit and allow nature to run its course, and that's what I really support. And I think plants want to grow, don't they? And I think we should allow them. And then when new plants move in, you know, it's like adding to your garden for free, isn't it? But I think the humans and people can come in, and our knowledge of how the plants behave and how they grow is what can help the garden to thrive. And so I think if we apply that knowledge, and when we look at things, if we know that they're quite invasive and they're going to take over and dominate, then we can thin those a little bit, and we can make space for some other species where perhaps they're slower growing or they need a bit more support. And I think that's so I think now there's a sort of movement maybe from being gardeners to maybe just being more curators and overseeing the collection and just editing it slightly and trying to have a lighter touch rather than a very heavy-handed touch, taking everything out, trying to allow space for things to move in and develop. And I think that's part of the joy of it, isn't it? Watching it develop, encouraging some plants, limiting others. And it's a balance, isn't it? So that's what I really enjoy about gardening.
From the perspective of a gardener, is it more work or less work to allow some of these native species to grow? Some of them, you know, can be quite overpowering. Does it make it more difficult for the gardener to keep them at bay than it would, for example, to just weed everything?
Well, I think if you just remove everything, it's a kind of, you can do that in a sort of thoughtless way, isn't it? Anything that's small, you just pull it out and completely clear it. It's like apocalypse sort of approach, isn't it, really? Just annihilate everything that's little. But in doing that, you can be removing some really valuable plants, some really nice, you know, delicate flowers. Like we've got Geranium robertianum, which is a native geranium, tiny little pink flowers. It's really beautiful as it sort of scrambles through the other plants. And it will sort of expand and take over areas a little bit, but it's not, you know, it can be pulled out fairly easily. And I think if you can allow these things to develop, then it brings an extra beauty, doesn't it? You know, the delicate little flowers, the way they scramble through other things, I think it can add another layer. And so I think it needs lots of observation, and it's the observation that's important rather than the physical work. So I think perhaps with a more ecological approach, there's less physical actually doing, but there's perhaps even an increase or the same amount of observation and watching the garden change and develop.
Do you think we're seeing a sea change right now? At the Chelsea Flower Show, for example, I think it was a third of the show gardens now featured weeds, as we call them, of some kind. Is that going to grow and grow?
Yeah, I think nowadays, from customers and other people I know who enjoy gardening, there's much more of an interest in a sort of ecological approach to planting and to gardens. And I think that comes from a sort of interest in the natural environment and the natural world, and wanting to see more of a natural palette. So I think we're seeing less kind of unusual, hard to grow plants that perhaps need to be in a conservatory over winter, and more of a move towards plants that are suitable for the soil types, for the aspects, and plants that will kind of maintain themselves a little bit. And I think if you can get that balance right, you can end up with a collection of plants that are suitable for the position they're in and that will sort of maintain themselves. They'll knit together as a community. And I think that's what we're seeing a move towards, that sort of more ecological thinking and a more ecological approach to gardening, I think.
I'm going to ask you a slightly philosophical question now, Dave. What do you think the purpose of a garden is? Is it solely there for human pleasure, or as we're facing more and more warnings about climate change, do you think it's there as a vehicle to sort of enhance nature, to enhance biodiversity? What's your view?
Well, I think there's a lot of studies going on at the moment into the effects of green space, isn't there? And I think there's already some evidence, showing that people's well-being and mental health are improved by being near green spaces. And I think having gardens, there's been studies that show that the diversity of planting in gardens is good for wildlife and good for biodiversity, and it's that mix of plants that people have in their gardens but are not necessarily in nature that brings extra nectar early in the season for insects, more flowering later in the season as well, and extending the season is important for a thriving wildlife, really. So I think gardens have an increasingly important role to play. And I think with the climate changing, people are starting to realise that nature and supporting nature and looking after nature is important. And I think gardens are there on our doorsteps, aren't they? They're something everybody can do. Everyone can be involved in planting trees, planting bushes, planting window boxes. All plants sequester CO2 through photosynthesis. And, I think connecting more closely with nature brings a benefit for everyone, for the planet and for people. And I think it's great to see that there's a bit more of enthusiasm for it, I think.
Well, Dave, if this garden is anything to go by, it's absolutely alive with nature. You've done a wonderful job, and thank you for showing it to us.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad that you've enjoyed it. It's nice to be here, isn't it? I think surrounded by nature and wildlife, and we can hear the bees buzzing. Thanks very much.